How can the world's most wanted man, responsible for the deaths of thousands, be hiding just miles from a major intelligence agency? Thousands of U.S. Special Forces, CIA operatives, Northern Alliance fighters, even mercenaries and criminal informants bribed by the U.S. were scouring every inch of Afghanistan's unforgiving mountains. But the architect of 9/11 wasn't holed up in some remote cave. He was living comfortably in Abbottabad, one of Pakistan's most important cities. And that wasn't by accident. It was exactly where Pakistan wanted him to be. This is how Osama Bin Laden managed to hide in plain sight of U.S. authorities. If you were on the run from the world's most powerful intelligence network backed by the Five Eyes Alliance, NATO, and partners across the Middle East, where would you hide? A cave with no cell service? A jungle deep in hostile territory? Maybe even off the grid entirely? Or how about just a compound, miles from a major military base, inside a country supposedly allied with the US, and in one of the most important cities, crawling with intelligence operatives? It sounds reckless, but if you're Osama Bin Laden and the Pakistani government is quietly playing along, it's not a gamble, it's calculated. It's never officially been proven that Pakistan knew where Bin Laden was hiding, or that the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency was shielding him. But we do know that the Pakistani doctor who helped confirm Bin Laden's presence is still locked away in solitary confinement, branded a traitor by Pakistan. Despite years of U.S. pressure, Islamabad refuses to release him. So, how did the world's most wanted man end up in the heart of a U.S. ally? First, we have to understand the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Like so many of the U.S.'s Cold War alliances, its partnership with Pakistan was one of convenience. Things were pretty friendly at first, with Muhammad Ayub Khan becoming president in 1958 after a successful military coup. During the Cold War, America's crusade for freedom often took a backseat to strategic convenience. Washington routinely backed authoritarian regimes, not for their democratic values, but for their willingness to stand against Soviet influence. It was realpolitik in action, ideas shelved in favor of pragmatic alliances for the sake of regional stability and influence. The U.S. would back Pakistan through both the Bangladesh Liberation War and the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, counterbalancing the Soviet-backed India. However, after losing to India and blaming the U.S. for not providing it with enough modern weapons, President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto became president and he cooled relations with the U.S. Bhutto's presidency quickly soured at home as well. His popularity plummeted and opposition parties began calling for regime change. Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq became the president of Pakistan following the successful 1977 military coup, and the first thing he did was suspend the constitution. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, aiming to prop up its flailing communist ally. The move caught President Jimmy Carter off guard, but not unprepared. The U.S. had already been quietly funneling support to Afghan rebel factions, and the invasion kicked that aid into overdrive. Washington began pumping tens of millions of dollars into the conflict with minimal oversight, handing weapons and cash to anyone willing to take on the Soviets. Pakistan quickly became the crucial middleman in the operation, masking the true origins of the aid and distributing it through its intelligence services. When concerns were raised about arming extremists, the Pakistanis gave vague assurances that the support wasn't going to the, quote, bad guys, and for the U.S., that was good enough. One of the individuals who would become a direct beneficiary of American aid was a young Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda was formed by Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, a Palestinian and part of the Muslim Brotherhood. The organization had been created to train Arab volunteers from all over the Muslim world to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan, as well as, well, pretty much anyone else who didn't prescribe to their specific brand of Islam. Despite his obvious extremist views, Azzam traveled around the world and was even welcomed to come to the United States to establish recruitment centers, the most prominent of which would be in Brooklyn. When some within the U.S. government and intelligence expressed concerns over Azzam's extremist views, senior officials assured them that there was nothing to worry about. Bin Laden was lured by Azzam's enchanting siren song of hate and eternal holy war. He brought with him his own wealth along with a generous donation from the Saudi royal family. But after a few years, Bin Laden became disillusioned with his mentor, not believing him to be extremist enough. This was despite Azzam famously saying, "Jihad and the rifle alone, no negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogues." Bin Laden decided to set up his own jihad and started a separate military training camp, competing with Azzam for leadership over his mujahideen. After defeating a Soviet advance in 1987, Bin Laden became a bit of a folk hero and a serious threat to Azzam's leadership. A year later, he split away and became enamored by the ideas of Ayman al-Zawahiri, a leader of Islamic Jihad which had killed Egypt's president in 1981. Al-Zawahiri gave Osama something that Azzam could never: the right to wage jihad against fellow moderate Muslims that Azzam sought to compromise with instead. On November 24, 1989, Azzam and his two sons were riding in their car when unknown assassins detonated a bomb, killing them, paving the way for bin Laden to take over al-Qaeda. The United States by now had given millions to the various groups who would eventually come under the banner of the terror group. Bin Laden would quickly become America's most wanted man, especially after his attacks on September 11th. So how exactly did he avoid capture with much of the world's intelligence services looking for him? It turns out, it helps to have friends inside the Pakistani government. The US knew that bin Laden was in Afghanistan at the onset of their invasion. On November 10, 2001, an informant spotted bin Laden in a massive convoy of 200 trucks headed toward a training camp in Tora Bora Mountain. It seems that bin Laden was hoping to repeat his success against the Soviets and grow his legend even further, repeating his success against Soviet forces in the Battle of Jaji in 1987. During that battle, bin Laden had famously held out against a much larger Soviet force, even leading daring raids into the enemy's flanks over the course of a week-long fight. The Soviets were eventually forced to withdraw, unable to gain control of the series of caves from the Mujahideen. But bin Laden wasn't facing a conscript Soviet army. He was facing the might of a vengeful United States, which led a force of 2,500 Afghan Eastern Shura fighters and numerous US, British, and German special forces and intelligence operatives. The opening gambit was a climb into the mountains by US special forces, who were led by local guides who were paid for their knowledge of the terrain and the ability to avoid ambushes. After several days of a grueling climb, the Special Forces detachment arrived at Tora Bora, where hundreds of al-Qaeda fighters had gathered for a glorious last stand. The detachment, made up of Special Forces and CIA operatives, codenamed Jawbreaker, immediately called for precision airstrikes. Scores of Mujahideen were killed as thousands of pounds of laser and satellite-guided bombs rained down on them. With the Afghan coalition fighters leading the charge, Jawbreaker called in airstrikes for 3 days straight as they fought to take the lower part of the mountain from al-Qaeda. However, the US had made the mistake of overly relying on their Afghan allies. First, the battle took place during Ramadan, meaning that Afghan fighters would leave the fighting every evening to break their fast and spend time with their families, much to the astonishment of the American forces. The Afghans were not ideologically motivated to fight al-Qaeda the way the US was, and to make the problems worse, two commanders within the Allied force hated each other, and their factions would spend just as much time firing on each other as on al-Qaeda. Jawbreaker requested a force of 800 Rangers to be immediately dispatched to block off the mountain passes leading from the complex. However, General Tommy Franks denied the request, wanting to put the risk instead on the Afghan coalition. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. As al-Qaeda was forced to retreat to higher positions, a team of elite Delta Force operators arrived disguised to look like Afghans. They recovered a radio from a killed fighter, and they confirmed bin Laden's presence by eavesdropping on al-Qaeda communications. As the Afghan fighters made their way up the mountain, assisted by US and British special forces, the US pinpointed bin Laden to a specific bunker, nailing it with a laser-guided bomb. Unfortunately, bin Laden had just fled the bunker 24 hours earlier, escaping certain death. On December 11th, the Delta Force Task Force intercepted radio calls indicating bin Laden was telling his men that it was okay to surrender, but it was believed to be a ploy to allow the fighters to slip out of Afghanistan. The task force intercepted more radio calls revealing that bin Laden was only 6 miles away and on the move. However, a blocking force had pinned down the Delta operators when their Afghan allies left to break their fast for Ramadan. This resulted in them being unable to pursue bin Laden, who slipped out of reach. 2 days later, al-Qaeda fighters negotiated a ceasefire with the Afghan fighters, claiming that they needed time to surrender their weapons. However, this was almost certainly a ploy to buy time for bin Laden and the other senior al-Qaeda leaders to flee. When US forces learned of the ceasefire, they were infuriated, but unable to convince the Afghans to push the attack. US aircraft continued bombing regardless, but ultimately bin Laden would escape. The over-reliance on Afghan allies who had no personal reason to fight al-Qaeda, the refusal to deploy the Ranger Force to seal off the escape routes, it would ultimately mean bin Laden would evade the US for nearly 9 years. The trail would pick up once more in mid-2002 when the wife of a trusted bin Laden courier and guard confirmed that she traveled with a tall, clean-shaven Arab from the border city of Peshawar to the remote Swat Valley. There, bin Laden met up with 2 Pakistanis who would act as guards and couriers during his time in Pakistan, enabling him to communicate without the fear of being detected by the US. The use of couriers would in fact prove instrumental in remaining undetected, as bin Laden had long ago learned just how fast the US could trace local communication. According to sources, though, bin Laden also met with a man in a Pakistani police uniform while in SWAT. The first clue that the Pakistani government was in full cooperation in hiding the world's most wanted terrorist. Bin Laden lived in the Shangla district in SWAT for 8 to 9 months, but hardly ever left the house. On one occasion that bin Laden did leave the safe house, the group was stopped by a policeman while visiting a local bazaar. The offense was speeding, and the driver managed to settle the matter before the officer realized who was sitting in the back seat of the car. Sometime in early 2003, bin Laden was visited by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was traveling under an alias with his wife and 7 children. Mohammed stayed with bin Laden for 2 weeks, after which he left. A month later, bin Laden was shocked to watch on Al Jazeera as joint CIA-ISI operations led to Mohammed's arrest in Rawalpindi. The joint raid signaled a high point in the U.S.-Pakistani relations, but they would quickly sour. Bin Laden quickly left SWAT, fearing that Mohammed would give away his location. It's unclear where he ended up, but 3 months later, bin Laden met 2 of his close associates in a house in Abbottabad. It's unclear if bin Laden had headed there immediately or had recently arrived. A modest 2-story house, bin Laden shared it with his wife, son, and 2 of his adult daughters. The group stayed there for 2 years, during which one of bin Laden's wives became pregnant twice. Each time she gave birth at a local clinic, with bin Laden's associates telling the doctors that she was deaf and dumb in order to avoid questions. In order to avoid detection and yet remain connected to the broader al-Qaeda network, bin Laden dispatched trusted couriers to place calls on his behalf, far away from the house. The couriers would drive all the way to Peshawar, 93 miles, or Rawalpindi, 40 miles away, and then once there they used public call offices to communicate with nodes within the terror network. However, the network itself was now largely decentralized. While bin Laden was still its head and still exercised authority, his communications restraint meant that the group was largely acting under the guidance of local commanders. This helped limit the type of advanced planning that would have led to another 9/11-style attack, as bin Laden dreamt of doing. Bin Laden knew, however, that he couldn't stay in his present home forever. Using al-Qaeda funding laundered through local individuals, he purchased a plot of land in Abbottabad, where a unique compound would be built especially for him. The home would be 2 stories, with custom-built walls that surrounded the entire enclosure. It would be tall enough to block the view of anyone either on the street or trying to surveil the site from afar. A double-gated entrance would allow the occupants to exercise strict security over anyone who entered. Completed in 2005, a year after being planned, the home was a miniature fortress that afforded bin Laden some comforts he didn't have in his present location, like a covered balcony that he could use to walk outside in the fresh air. The group moved into the home in August of 2005, and though it was a very secure facility, its security features would eventually raise CIA suspicion, and that would prove fatal to bin Laden. Along with an 18-foot-tall wall, the compound also featured an on-site trash-burning pit, as well as no outside connections except for power and gas. These connections made use of 4 separate meters, an attempt to hide excess use of electricity and gas and thus prevent the discovery of how many individuals occupied the home. Bin Laden's 2 most trusted guards and couriers, brothers, posed with false identities as businessmen for the purpose of the local paperwork. They claimed to be fleeing from Pakistan's tribal areas in the north after a fierce family feud, telling the authorities that this was the reason for the compound's high walls and isolation. When a major earthquake struck Pakistan in October, the group used that opportunity to add a 3rd unauthorized story to the building under the guise of conducting repairs. Another stroke of luck resulted in the influx of Pashtun migrants, which helped bin Laden and his group better hide amongst the native Abbottabad residents. The 2 couriers would act as the face of the compound, attending a local mosque to offer prayers. Locals described them as kind and polite. The 2 would also be responsible for buying all food and provisions that the home needed. Back in the compound, the only person allowed to enter it was the neighbor who lived across from it in the small house. He would enter the compound to work the garden, being paid under $5 a day for his work. Bin Laden's son, Khalis, would look after all the plumbing and the maintenance issues in the compound, as well as a cow brought in from their neighbor for food. Life in the compound was a frugal one, according to the testimony of bin Laden's wives. The terror mastermind had left his wealth far in the past, owning only 3 pairs of local Pakistani dress for summer and 3 heavier sets for winter. He also owned a single black jacket, 2 sweaters, and a cowboy hat. Apparently, Bin Laden was quite fond of the hat, frequently wearing it both indoors and outdoors where it served to protect him from aerial surveillance. Famously, Bin Laden suffered from various medical ailments that affected his kidneys and heart. He would complain of feeling sluggish on occasion, but instead of seeing a doctor, he would simply eat a candy bar or an apple. Testimony from his wives, along with intelligence gathered inside the home, indicates that it's unlikely he ever saw a doctor during his time in the compound. Bin Laden's children lived the same secluded life as their father. He oversaw the religious education of his grandchildren himself and supervised their playtime. He loved friendly competitions, especially when it came to gardening. Bin Laden would reward whichever grandchild grew the best-looking vegetables. Bin Laden's daughters began wearing a veil by the age of 3. They, along with the other women, also protected their dignity by practicing strict seclusion from any men, including men on television. The wives and children of his couriers, however, had more freedom, with the ability to leave the compound from time to time. Some of their children are reported to have played cricket with the local children, though all education was done inside the compound. Generally, their families were kept completely separated from Bin Laden's family, though the women were afforded 15 minutes a month to socialize with each other. The families were kept in such isolation from each other that one of the courier's children one day asked her father why the uncle who lives upstairs never went to the bazaar. Her father told her that he was too poor to do so, so she took to calling him Miskin Baba, or poor uncle. However, one day in January of 2011, while watching television, she spotted a picture of Bin Laden on Al Jazeera, recognizing him as Miskin Baba. Her father became upset and all the women in the family were banned from watching TV. There would also be complete segregation between the families of the couriers and Bin Laden's after that incident. Despite using all public call boxes, the US eventually tracked down the two brothers acting as Bin Laden's couriers and guards. What happened next was hugely embarrassing for the Pakistani government. Pakistan would launch its own internal investigation into how the world's most wanted terrorist was living in Pakistan's own version of West Point, with Abbottabad being a military garrison city hosting the nation's most elite military academies and homes to many of its senior military and intelligence leadership. Per the Pakistani Army Board of Inquiry, Osama Bin Laden had avoided detection due to the extremely low profile that he maintained, as well as the phased construction and the occupation of the compound itself. In the end, Bin Laden's time in Abbottabad left more questions than answers about how much Pakistan really knew, how secretive its military operations were, and whether allies truly trusted each other. Officials said that he slipped through the cracks thanks to the stealth and clever construction. But that explanation didn't sit right with those in U.S. intelligence agencies. It wasn't just about one man being elusive. It exposed real weaknesses in a system built to catch him. And the fallout would shake up intelligence networks and diplomatic ties for a long time. While the world tried to unravel how Bin Laden managed to hide in plain sight, what came next was even stranger. Watch insane things discovered on Osama Bin Laden's hard drive, or click on this video instead.